This is Hooks and Runs, a podcast about baseball, music, and culture. Here are your hosts, Craig and Rex.
You know, I'm an ophthalmologist in my day job.
I knew that, yeah.
And a couple of the other ophthalmologists in town retired, and so all of a sudden I'm the only guy taking call at the hospital, and so I just got busy, and plus, you know, I like the guys in the 60s, early 70s, the guys I grew up watching as a kid, and unfortunately, you know, most of them are passed away. The last 5 or 10 years, all the guys that played with them are, and
right.
You know, that's the most fun part of doing research for these old guys and talking to them and stuff.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, we've had a few major league players, and they're getting harder to come by from the 60s, especially.
yeah,
I'd love to find somebody that played in the Polo Grounds. I'd just love to know, talk to somebody,
yeah,
but they're just not
yeah,
around anymore.
yeah. And once the guys started making money, you know, it's a noticeable difference. The guys that, you know, played in the 80s, they don't want to talk. They don't have time for you. And, you know,
Right. Yeah.
once you become the best guys were the old relief pitchers. You know, they were making $5,000 a year and
Yeah.
nobody ever knew their name. You get one of them on the phone, they'll talk for hours.
Yeah.
Because they sat out in the bullpen telling stories all the time anyway.
They got all the best stories.
Yeah.
So anyway, Doug Wilson is a former college baseball player, a SABR member. That's the Society for American Baseball Research. He has some acclaimed books about baseball and baseball players. He is a Casey Award finalist, a Seymour Medal finalist, both for the best baseball books of the year. He is the author of Let's Play 2, The Life and Times of Ernie Banks. Doug is here as we continue our series on Hooks and Runs, Texans in the Hall, native-born Texans in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Past episodes in the series so far have included Willie Wells, Ross Youngs, Greg Maddux, and most recently, Rogers Hornsby. So, Doug, welcome to Hooks and Runs, and thanks for coming on to talk about Ernie Banks.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
It's our pleasure. Absolutely. So, for people of a certain age, we were just talking about our time growing up watching the players of the 60s and the 70s, and for people of a certain age like us, I guess, who had the privilege of watching these players like Ernie Banks play, there's something early in your book that really grabbed my attention, and that is that Ernie's grandfather was born a slave in Georgia, and I guess it was his family that migrated to Texas after the Civil War, or was it Ernie's dad that came to Texas?
Actually, you know, both families, and that's something people don't realize. You know, you think the Civil War and slavery was, you know, centuries and centuries ago, but here's a guy we watched play who, you know, could touch that. You know, his father was, his grandfather had been a slave, and actually grandfathers on both sides.
Right.
And they had moved to East Texas, and then his mother and father moved over across the state to Dallas.
That was it. Yeah, that was it. They moved to Louisiana. So that was my point. American history is not that long ago. We know people, or we watch people play baseball that knew people that had been born into slavery, and it was just amazing how things changed, and in some ways how things stayed the same for those players and athletes. We like to talk about on Hooks and Runs where we are born and where we grow up and how we grow up. The environment that we grow up in really influences our life as adults. How did growing up in a large, poor family in Redline, Dallas shape Ernie Banks into the player and person that you describe on the back of your book as, quite accurately, I would say, as one of the most beloved men in baseball history?
Yeah, and certainly probably the most beloved player in Chicago to this day. It's amazing looking at Ernie's childhood that he could come from a place like that to get to where he eventually, you know, landed. A guy who met 5 or 6 presidents. He had a private audience with the Pope even when he was older. But, you know, growing up from a really, really poor family, 8 or 9 kids, during the Depression, everybody was poor. But where he lived, it was a couple notches below being poor. And I mentioned one time he talked about watching his mother. He was saying how amazing she could put meals together and stuff. And sometimes him and his mother would go down to the corner grocery store and go through the garbage to pull out bones and pieces of meat that they had thrown out, and she would take that home to feed the family. And
Wow.
so that's a level of poverty we can't imagine nowadays, where everybody's got a big screen TV and
Sure.
the latest cell phone. And so he came from that level, and really through just determination, plus the stroke of being an exceptional athlete, but he had to take advantage of that athletic ability and make the right decisions.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, you talk about that in the book. Some of his really had kind of an innate ability to stay out of trouble when he was growing up
Yeah.
in that part of Dallas, when it was kind of hard to stay out of trouble sometimes.
Yeah, and I was lucky to find 3 or 4 guys who grew up with him, and who a couple were friends and played football and stuff. And that's what they all said, that Ernie hardly ever got in fights as a kid. He said everybody, all kids get in fights, but they would turn around and Ernie was gone. If a group of guys would be
Yeah. He could sense
thinking
it
of
coming.
doing something bad, he would just disappear.
Yeah.
He just had this ability to know, he had this inner clock that something bad's going to happen. I'm out of here. And
Yeah.
and in that environment too, later on he talked about some of his good friends got involved in drugs or, shootings and things, and didn't make it out of North Dallas. And, and so it wasn't totally luck. It was decisions that he
Sure.
made.
Yeah, he made some good decisions. You could see that. So one of the things you wrote about Ernie when he was commenting later on his childhood, he said, "We never had the feeling we were poor." And I think
Yeah,
that was a
and
little bit of an advantage to not know how poor you were in those
well,
days.
as a kid, sometimes you try to put the best face on things, and the other thing, it's Ernie always put the best look on everything, and I
Mm.
think part of that was his optimistic view. Like I said, if he didn't know he was poor, he was the only one around. Everybody knew that those guys were poor, but
Yeah.
I think the point was, you made the best of it. He
Sure.
talked about making kites out of newspapers, and making skates out of pieces of wood and wheels, and so they made their own things. You learn to make do with what you got
Yeah, I think
and not dwell on it.
how much of that though do you think is not having a media environment where you can turn on TV and see the
Yeah,
lifestyles of the rich and famous? That's kind of reaching back, but so much of what we see on the
yeah.
media is celebrity
I
culture and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. What you know is what the other kids in your neighborhood know, and you do what they're doing, and they're doing what they need to survive. You don't know any better sometimes, and so that's a really good point.
Yeah, I kind of wonder when I see that. You hear that from people in that generation. Then in the Depression, everybody was poor. In Ernie Banks's case, they grew up a little poorer than most, but still, I mean, how much was he really exposed to? What we now know as like the billionaire culture or the celebrity culture that
Yeah,
seems to dominate the media. So
yeah.
go ahead.
They wouldn't have known nothing about that.
Sure. Yeah, that's what I was wondering when I read that. So Ernie Banks seems like one of these people that just kind of an overview of his adult life, even beginning as a teenager playing in the Negro Leagues, the post Jackie Robinson Negro Leagues. Seemed like a person that the consistent feeling that I got when you would relate what other people said about Ernie Banks was he was just somebody that always felt like they were just a better person for having known him. He was just one of those people that just reflected a positive attitude and a positive impact on people that he came in contact with.
Yeah, I think you'd have a hard time finding anybody who didn't like him. Early on as a teenager, and even his early year or two with the Cubs, he was pretty quiet, till I guess he figured out that he belonged. But yeah, he was a nice guy. Everybody liked him, and he always seemed to fit in. And plus, joining some of those teams, it didn't take people very long to see that he was better than everybody else.
That
One
helps.
guy who was there when he came up with the Cubs said, they got this new guy. They're looking at him around the batting cage. Within 10 minutes, he knew he's better than anybody on the team.
Yeah.
And he's a 21-year-old kid. So that gives you a little bit of acceptance because everybody wants to win.
Sure. I'm just drawing a blank. If you'll give me a second, who was the second baseman that came up with him, or the other shortstop? Was it Gene?
Yeah, Gene Baker.
Yeah,
Yeah, at the time, it was kind of the convention to bring up two African Americans at the same time because uh, they needed somebody to room with. This was way before Brian Piccolo and Gale Sayers.
right.
And so for company and to help ease with the adjustment. And so they were the first two African Americans who had ever been promoted to the majors in the Cubs organization. They arrived the same day. Baker had a pulled hamstring, so Ernie was in the starting lineup the next day. So he was the first to play.
Right. So Ernie Banks, as I mentioned, played in the Negro Leagues, but this was a time when the Negro Leagues were today. They're not; those teams are not recognized as Major League Baseball because they've been so depleted by the majors. Ernie Banks was a rare case of a player who came from the Negro Leagues right into the starting lineup, which I think was interesting.
Yeah, that's again a testament to his talent and maybe to his ability to get along. But you look at all the great players. Of course, Jackie Robinson spent a year in Montreal.
Right.
Roy Campanella spent a year. All the Dodgers. That was sort of Ricky's plan.
Right.
They all spent a year or so. Willie Mays spent a year hitting 400 in Minneapolis. Hank Aaron, spent a year somewhere. But Ernie went directly. He played his last Negro League game in Pittsburgh, got on a plane. 2 days later, he was in a Cubs uniform playing for the Cubs. So there was no minor leagues. He's 21 years old. But, so that was extremely unusual for somebody to go directly from the Negro Leagues to the majors, and especially as an infielder. You look at a lot of the guys. Monty Irvin was an infielder. A lot of the really good players, they moved him to the outfield. But to put, Ernie was the shortstop, right after he got there. So it didn't, like I said, it didn't take long for people to realize what kind of talent this guy had.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then Gene Baker eventually got healthy and became the second baseman, and they were an up the middle keystone double play combination for a few years in Chicago.
Yeah. One year they both made the All-Star team, so they were really good. And Gene Baker had the reputation. He played 4 years in Los Angeles in the Pacific Coast League, and he was pretty much acknowledged the best shortstop in the Pacific Coast League, which was a really tough league back in those days. But when they got there, they looked and figured Ernie was going to be the best long-term shortstop, so they shifted Baker to second. And but that was a pretty good find to bring two guys up like that.
Absolutely. In your book, you talk about the death of barnstorming, which is a great little piece of Americana. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about what barnstorming is and what killed it off.
Yeah, you look back even to the days of Babe Ruth. Guys would play their major league season, and then the better players would get together, and they would mostly tour through the Midwest and South because good weather, October, November. Sometimes they'd make more money doing that than they made the whole season in major league salaries. But it was a chance for people in little towns all over America to see major league players because, of course, you didn't have TV. And so you'd hear them on the radio and wonder what they look like. Here it is in November. They're coming to play the local American Legion team or something, and everybody would go out. The main thing that killed it, one was, of course, television, and then later players starting to make more money, and then, of course, as the Negro Leagues were winding down, they still had several teams. Jackie Robinson made a good living. He would get Willie Mays, a bunch of those guys together, and they would tour into the late 50s. But it kind of winded down there. But it was a great piece of Americana. You could, like I said, any little town and you would go, there would be a sign somewhere where Babe Ruth hit the longest home run on this little field. It's probably 500 places in the country like that. But that's something you're not going to see Aaron Judge, turning up in Columbus, Indiana in November playing a game.
Exactly. Yeah, the money just doesn't work because the players in those days were looking to pick up some money, and as you mentioned, they could make more sometimes in their barnstorming than they could, and sometimes they would go abroad. Did Ernie Banks? I don't remember from the book. Did Ernie Banks go abroad ever to play in Europe or something?
Well, he played in Europe when he was in the Army,
Okay.
right before he joined the Cubs. But yeah, not
Okay, that's what it
Barnstormer.
was. Yeah, that's what it was.
But yeah, for example, his first year in the majors, I think he made the minimum, $5,000 a year, and so they could knock that out in a good 2-month tour through the South after the season.
Yeah, yeah. I was going to ask you what do you think, having looked at Ernie Banks' career, began in 1954, I believe it was, and he played into 1971. He was a regular to 1969. What do you think accounts for the Cubs' mediocrity during these years? They had Ernie Banks, later Billy Williams, later Ron Santo, 3 Hall of Famers, excellent players, a great defensive Fergie Jenkins in the pitching staff. I was going to mention the double play combination of Beckert and Kessinger after a time. They also had other good pitchers: Ken Holtzman, Bill Hands, Mil Pappas, Larry Jackson, Dick Ellsworth, all 20-game winners at some point. And yet, a typical Cubs season, if they had a winning record, would be maybe 84 wins. Do you buy the no night game philosophy or theory, or what do you think?
Absolutely not. In one word, well, I guess 2 words is bad management.
Okay.
That's it in a nutshell. The owner, P.K. Wrigley, was a great chewing gum man, and but he had made the decision early on that the Cubs had to stand on their own financially. And so it's not like George Steinbrenner, where he reaches in his pocket and goes out and gets some great players. He could have done that easily. Cubs could have been the best team, or rivaled the Yankees. And the other thing is, Wrigley felt like he seemed to know more than everybody else, and he surrounded himself with yes men.
Okay.
And so they made some horrendous decisions, but they almost never had a good quality pitching staff. They would have a few pitchers, but the rest of them were abysmal rejects from everybody else. And it was really Ernie's first about 10 years, they were terrible. There were several years where they came in last or second to last. And, even when he won the MVP back to back, it was a big deal because he was one of the first players to win the MVP playing for a team in the second division, which in those days, the top 4 teams was called the first division, and they shared a little bit in the World Series shares. The lower ones were the second division, and Cubs were always in the second division. But it was a big deal when Leo DeRocher came in '66. That was really the first good manager they had ever had. And Leo had enough personality to force Wrigley to kind of keep his mouth shut, and it was Leo who brought in Fergie Jenkins and Holtzman and Bill Hands, some of the good pitchers, and he turned them into contenders. They had some epic failures at the end of the season a few times, but they were a quality team in the late '60s. And the other thing, they had the great players, but in those days, up until '69, only one team made the playoffs.
Sure.
You won the National League, you went to the World Series, and there were some good teams they played against. The Cardinals were great in those years. The Giants were always good. And so it was tough to win the pennant in those days. So.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about Leo DeRocher, but before we do that, I want to ask you about another coach that they had, or coaches that they had. The Chicago Cubs had this bizarre college of coaches theory. What was that all about, and how did that work for Chicago? And
yeah, well, I think you answered your question right there. What was that all about? You look at it, and that's really all you can say. And that was, again, Wrigley. He liked to think he was an innovator, and so he came up with a deal where instead of one manager who's in charge, you got 5 or 6 managers, and one guy would be a manager for a month, then the next guy would manage, and you can imagine that's horrible. The players hated it. You had a guy named Lou Brock who was a kid who looked like he might be able to play. The one manager of the month told him to bunt and steal. The next manager of the month told him to swing for the fences. And he was so mixed up, so they dump him for a rag arm guy named Ernie Broglio, and the rest is history for the
Exactly.
Cardinals.
Yeah.
But I mean, he's just a typical case. Nobody knew who was in charge because nobody was in charge.
Right. Yeah.
And of course you'd get some backbiting, and one coach would undermine the other coach, and so that was just typical of the Cubs in those years.
Yeah.
They were the laughing stock of the majors. All the other teams made fun of them for that.
Yeah, I think that was in '62. They had the College of Coaches, and the Astros and Mets were the expansion teams, and the Cubs were so bad the Astros finished ahead of them. Not the Astros, though, the Colts in those days, the Colt 45s. But yeah, I've always been amazed. How bad do you have to be to finish behind the expansion team? And then you look at who the Astros, who the Colts had, and it's like they didn't have any players. They had a couple of players, but that was it. But the Cubs were below them. Yeah. What was Ernie Banks' relationship with Leo DeRocher?
Well, that's the classic part, and that was really the most fun part of researching the book, was talking to some of the guys on the team who played with him. And if you went down in history and you said, let's pick out two guys who are absolutely the most opposite personalities in the world, and you stick them together in a dugout for 162 games a year and sit back and watch what happens. I mean, that's basically what happens. I mean, Leo DeRocher was the classic. He hated everybody and everybody hated him. He would do absolutely anything to win a ball game. Nice guys finish last. And here was Ernie, who was the nice guy. He actually won nice guy awards. Yeah. Everybody in the majors loved him. And by the time Leo came in, Ernie was an icon in Chicago. He was Mr. Cub. Everybody loved him. And Wrigley, the owner, to his credit, loved Ernie too. And Leo liked his modus operandi was to come in, clean house, bring in his guys, and sometimes start over and whip them into a winning team. And Wrigley let him know right away, Ernie's untouchable. Nobody's going to mess with him. And so Leo had a little chip on his shoulder to begin with because of that. There's too much ego. And Leo went out of his way the first couple years to try to embarrass Ernie and to try to shame him off the field because he knew he couldn't trade him. So he would bring in all these rookies like John Boccabella, Lee Thomas, and give them the first base job in spring training. And every year, Ernie just kept smiling and kept hitting the ropes. And by the end of spring training, he was still starting first baseman and still playing good. But Leo tried about 3 years to run him off, and he finally just gave up. But Ernie would just, no matter what Leo would say, what he would do to embarrass him, Ernie would just nice him to death. He never argued with him. He would just smile and grin and go along, and eventually wore him down.
Yeah. Ernie Banks was great career, two-time MVP, as we mentioned, 14 All-Star games, Mr. Cub. He did get elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1977. What was that like for Ernie? What was his response to that?
I think typical of everything. He went in with a big smile on his face, and he made it a point every single year to come back. And, he would be out there schmoozing with fans, joking, talking, just loving it all. And I think to him, too, it was a validation of everything he had gone through his whole life working his way up.
Post-baseball life was, in many respects, for Ernie Banks, he was an ambassador for the Cubs for many years, at least until 1983. There was a break there. He had some time in business, and eventually unsuccessful venture in the car business, and then a little time in the banking world. He never, though, seemed to escape being Ernie Banks, Mr. Cub. On the whole, did Ernie Banks enjoy his retirement and life after baseball?
By all appearances, he did. When he finally passed away, there was some reports that he didn't really have that much money left. And one thing was, a lot of people said, Ernie was such a nice guy, he could never say no. Lots of people would come up and want money and, would offer him big investment deals, and he would get into it. And so he did, he was more of a dabbler. He dabbled in the banking business, dabbled in the car business. most of his jobs, he would have some executive position, but really his job was to be Ernie Banks, to greet people, shake hands, and all that.
Yeah.
And he eventually, uh, the Mr. Cub persona, if he didn't like that, he certainly didn't try to avoid it, because there are lots of reports he'd walk in a restaurant. Within 2 minutes, everybody in the place knew Ernie Banks was there. He'd be waving, hollering at people across the room, going up to total strangers and starting conversations, always laughing and joking. And that was just his public personality, and he seemed to enjoy it.
In your epilogue, you wrote that Ernie Banks was, quote, absurdly simple and impossibly complex. What did you mean by that?
Well, that is, even when he was playing, there was always a question of, is this guy too good to be true? He never complained. Every year in spring training, he would make up a jingle about how the Cubs were going to win. And, every single year, of course, they never won. And everybody knew they had no chance watching the roster. But, every year,
Yeah.
Today's a new day. We're going to win. We're going to play two, and we're going to win them all. And he was just so optimistic. And a lot of people said, yeah, that's an act. Nobody can be that way. And that grew into the Mr. Cub, persona. And, nobody really knows other than Ernie himself. And he never really said, he had a way of, when reporters would try to dig deep and get to what laid underneath his personality, he would smile and change the subject and go on laughing and joking. And so there is a mystery about what's the real Ernie Banks really like. Did it bother him? He never said. So
Yeah.
he always just tried to put a positive spin on everything, and at the end of the day, he always tried to make everybody else around him smile and happy. And so that's something good if you can say that.
Yeah, Ernie Banks in 1958 hit 47 home runs, drove in 129 runs, playing shortstop for the Cubs. The next year, 45 and 143, hitting over 300. The next year, 1960, 41 home runs, 117 RBIs. These are the standout years. He did 43 in 1957, but he continued to hit a lot of home runs until he eventually moved to first base. He was hitting that with that much power and that much run production at a time when shortstops barely hit. I think one of those years you mentioned in your book, he had 40-something home runs, and the rest of the shortstops in the National League hit fewer than that combined.
Yeah, nobody had ever seen a shortstop do that.
Today we see shortstops that have done that. We have for some time. Cal Ripken Jr. comes to mind. Obviously, Alex Rodriguez played shortstop. We got some today that can hit the long ball. Do you think Ernie Banks is remembered as kind of way ahead of his time today? What do baseball fans today think about Ernie Banks, particularly outside Chicago?
Yeah, that's the problem. I don't think he is remembered. He doesn't get near the credit. There was a 6-year period from like 55 to 60 where he hit more home runs than anybody in the majors. He hit more home runs over those years than Mickey Mantle, Willie Mays, Hank Aaron. I mean, he hit more than anybody. And he did it as a shortstop. And like you said, most shortstops of the time were like Phil Rizzuto or, pesky little guys who might steal some bases or throw sand in your face while they're still in second base. But if they hit 1 or 2 home runs a year, it was a mistake. And he came in just right from the start hitting, and nobody had ever seen anything like that. His second year in the majors, he hit 44 homers. He broke the National League record for home runs by a shortstop before the All-Star break.
That's crazy.
23.
Yeah.
And so, he was ahead of his time, and people just don't seem to give him the credit for as great of a hitter as he was. He had some knee problems around 61, and that's why they moved him to first base from shortstop. And it did cut down some of his production. He had a lot of physical problems. He still had some good years, but never as great as those 5 or 6 years in his prime. But yeah, I mean, he was just an unbelievable hitter to production.
I was going to say, yeah, he did hit 512 home runs. It's not like he fell off the earth. And his last year as a regular, 1969, he hit 253, a little bit down, 23 home runs. He still drove in 106 runs.
Yeah,
that was his last year as a regular, 38 years old. Yeah. So
and the other thing too about the 512 homers is that was when 500 homers was 500 homers.
Yeah, it meant a lot.
It's not like when all of a sudden guys are hitting 70 homers a year and you do that in 6 years or something. When he did it, there'd only been like 9 or 10 guys ever who would hit 500 homers. So that number's kind of pedestrian now. That some of the guys flew right by it, but this was before steroids and everything else. So
Mantle,
that was a big deal.
Mantle did not. He did get there, I think.
He had like 534.
534. Yeah, Mays, Aaron, 500. Yeah, a few came along then. Banks was one of them, though.
Yeah,
that had both the
but
power.
There wasn't that many at the time.
Right. They had the power and the longevity to get there. So whatever was going on with his knees, he still made a big impact. So our guest has been Doug Wilson. The book is Let's Play 2, The Life and Times of Ernie Banks. Came out in 2019, but Doug has been gracious enough to come on and share some stories about Ernie Banks in our series, Texans in the Hall. And Doug, thanks so much for being here.
Well, thanks again for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
All right. Thank you so much. Rex and I will be right back. We're going to talk about Pete Rose in part 2, so stick with us. So, Rex, we've been out of pocket for a month.
Yeah.
And something big happened in baseball. I know big for you, big for me too, but kind of big for me, but very big for you. Commissioner Manfred has said a lifetime suspension is only for the lifetime.
Yep. Now that he's passed away, he's back on the books. Of course, that's an interesting decision because that means a lot of people are back on the books now.
All the Black Sox and probably the only thing left really, what does it mean to end a lifetime suspension for someone who's deceased? They can't get a coaching job. They can't do anything other than get elected to the Hall of Fame. So the Hall of Fame says if you're under suspension, you're not eligible. And I think they've said that now they're eligible, but the issue is how will they be voted on? How will basically we're talking about 3 players. Pete Rose is obviously the one that's in the forefront of everyone's mind, the most recent of the banned players. Then you have Shoeless Joe, a career .356 hitter, who's generally regarded as a player that, had it not been for the Black Sox scandal and the suspension, the lifetime suspension, would have been a shoo-in for the Hall of Fame had his career just finished in a natural progression from where he was in 1920. And then probably a more marginal player, but somebody that is usually in the discussion for the Hall of Fame is Eddie Seacott, who was a pitcher. And people have different opinions about whether he would be in or out. The rest of the players, for the most part, would not be getting Hall of Fame consideration. They would have been considered as coaches. They would have been considered as managers, general managers, perhaps, but not Hall of Fame, to be sure. So let's talk about Pete Rose.
Obviously, I think Pete's going to make it.
I don't know what the process is going to be. I think if you go through the writers, there will be a lot of pushback. Normally you're eligible through the Writers Association, the Baseball Writers Association, if you have been retired for 5 years, and now the rule is you're eligible to be on the ballot for 10 years as long as you're getting over 5% of the vote. That may change as you go further down the line. You may have to get to 10 or 15. I don't know exactly how that works, but for the most part, your first year you have to get 5% of the votes that are cast to stay on the ballot. And then you need 75% of the votes that are cast to be in the Hall. So Pete Rose brings a lot of baggage. There's the gambling. There's the allegations regarding girls that were too young. I don't know about those. I have no idea about those either. It's been, talked about a lot. I think because of the ban, it was never really explored. I don't know if there's any truth to that. I don't know anything about it. I know it's circulating. And Rose had friends, no question. He had, obviously, a lot of people respected what he did on the field. He also has a lot of enemies. And writers can be a little prickly, and they're particular about that, as we know, with Bonds and Clements and A-Rod.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not, if it goes through the writers, but that would be atypical because Rose has already gone through that. I guess I don't know what the ban meant. I know Joe Jackson was voted on, but that was a long time ago.
I don't see Jackson making it, to be honest with you. It's too long ago.
Well, that's the thing. You're going to have the other option for these players is to go through what I'm still calling the Veterans Committee. They don't call it that. They call it something else now. That's how Dave Parker and one other player are getting in. Dick Allen are getting in through the Veterans Committee. What I'm calling the Veterans Committee, but is really something else. And that they will normally pick 8 finalists, and then they will select. I don't know how the voting works. I know it's a very small committee relative to like the writers, which has like almost 400 voters. This may have 16 voters and they get so many votes or whatever. So you put Rose on there. Do you put Jackson and Seacott? I don't know. I kind of think with Seacott, to me, was among the most guilty of the Black Sox. So even if you liked his numbers, which were competitive for other Hall of Famers of that era, like Stan Kovaleski, for one, Chief Bender, maybe the similar player who's in the Hall. And it's also similar to some players that aren't in the Hall. There was kind of a line there where, why is this one in and that one not from that time period?
Right.
But I don't think Seacott gets considered because he was so guilty of the. Now Jackson is a kind of a colorable case for him not being as culpable or even culpable in terms of like he threw the games. And so he may get, but I don't know. The thing about that is you're holding people off the ballot that otherwise should be on Bobby Grich, maybe, or a Lou Whitaker or somebody like that. It just seems to me like there's problematic. But I think Rose, when the Veterans Committee comes back around in 27, they do it every 2 years. Mm-hmm. Rose is going to be on the ballot. He'll be one of the 8. And we'll see. And that'll be, ball players and people that are a lot closer to playing the game than the writers. And they're going to look at that 4,200 hits and they're going to say, come on.
Yeah. Yeah, he's going to make it.
Come on.
I'm confident at this point.
Yeah. So. And again, I don't have really, I know you have strong feelings about it. I don't have really strong feelings about it. The only thing that I'd said, as you know, many times, Rex, was if you're going to lift the ban for Pete Rose, you need to lift the ban for all the players that are deceased. And from the Hall of Fame point of view, that's what they did. So I'm happy with that. And everybody will rise or fall, but on their accomplishments. But Pete Rose, you can't argue with it. 4,256 hits. People can say what they want about Pete Rose off the field. There's a lot of Hall of Famers with big problems with off the field behavior. Let's face that. So
that's if that were the measure we were holding these guys to, we'd have to go and clear out 3/4 of the Hall of Fame.
It wouldn't be a hall; it'd be a closet.
Yeah, pretty much.
It'd be a closet. Joe Jackson, a 356 hitter. It's hard to turn your head on that. There's only just 4 or 5 players in Major League history that were better hitters than Joe Jackson. He had 168 triples, which is a lot of triples. He led the league in triples several times, and he was considered one of the best hitters of the dead ball era, along with Ty Cobb. Interesting thing about Eddie Seacott, he had a great nephew named Al Seacott, who pitched in the major leagues in the 50s and 60s, including a short tour of duty with the Houston Colt 45s, I believe, in like 63. So that would be an interesting thing to think about. Here's another Seacott, back in the big leagues. Back in the big leagues. So you think Rose is in? You think Jackson's not gonna be considered? He may not even make a ballot. I mean, he may not ever make.
I don't feel like he's going to make a ballot. And the Veterans Committee is different, but as far as the writers and stuff, I don't feel like he's going to.
I don't think they're going to go through the writers. I don't. I think they're going to have to wait because of the passage of time. I think the writers have a pretty strict requirement of 5 years retired. Then you get your next 10 years to get in. Then you go on after 15 years, and you your fate is in the hands of this Veterans Committee. I wish I could remember what they call that, but but I can't. I didn't look. I'm a little rusty. So anyway, what else is that? Well, okay. Well, one of the things, Rex, I know you've learned with the podcast is, do you have anything else on Pete Rose? This is a big moment for you. I want you to get it.
Yeah, no, yeah. I'm jazzed by it. Obviously.
So, one of the things that I know you from the podcast or have learned from the podcast is we don't look at standings until Memorial Day.
Yeah, I know.
And it is now.
I know where this is going to.
After Memorial Day. Now, yeah. I think we can lift the rule for the Rockies. If you are this bad,
yeah,
you don't have to wait till Memorial Day to know you're in deep trouble.
Yeah,
this is we talked a lot last year about the White Sox, and oh my God, the White Sox are on a 40-win pace, and are they going to have fewer wins than the 1962 New York Mets? And they ended up 41 and won 21, which is horrible. And but compared to the Rockies, they were almost the 27 Yankees. The Rockies are 9-45. They're on a 27-win pace. This is bad at a whole nother level of bad.
Yeah.
Now
you gotta work hard to be this bad.
You got to work hard to be this bad. I don't know how they're doing it. I don't know how a baseball team can play in Coors Field at mile-high altitudes, and their team batting average is at home, not the team batting average overall, but at home, is the same as their team batting average, as the league average.
Oh, wow.
Just like, are you kidding me?
Mm-hmm.
Are you kidding me? So the Rocky pitchers are, while the hitters do not seem to recognize that they're playing at this high altitude, the pitchers do. So the Rockies are batting 242 at home, and the opposing batters are hitting 308. So they're crushing the ball. They're thinking it's 1930. They're hitting 308.
Yeah.
This is and now, and it's bad for the fans. This is a team that I think they were the first team ever to draw 4 million people. This was a wildly successful franchise in terms of fan attention, fan participation. Made a World Series once before. One of the most exciting teams in baseball when they were scoring runs by the bushel. I don't know how, like you said, I don't know how you get this bad. This is mismanagement on a whole nother level.
Yeah. If there was some kind of prize, I'd say they were doing it on purpose. But
there's nothing. What's in it for them? Yeah. I mean, the White Sox. Yeah, the White Sox are really bad still. They're 17-37, better than last year. But my God, this is awful. This is just.
I'm surprised you haven't given me flack yet in the fact that yes, the wheels certainly fell off of the Padres.
Not really. They've lost 7 of 10, but they are only 2 games behind the Dodgers, who are not playing much better. They've lost 6 out of 10. The Dodgers, the Padres, and the Giants are all having a great season. In fact, if you look at the National League standings, the St. Louis Cardinals are 30-24. That's a .556 winning percentage. They would be out of the playoffs today. The top 6 teams in the National League are all playing exceptional baseball. And the top 6 in the American League are going to be the wildcard teams. The wildcard teams going into the games today, and Houston's going to win. They're winning pretty big over Oakland to start that series. It's Tuesday the 27th, by the way. Houston is in the playoffs at 28-25 with Cleveland and Minnesota. So only one team from the East, the Yankees, would be in the playoffs. So that's a total turnaround. You've got the
That
Central
really is.
Central Division with 4 teams over 500, and you've got the East Division with just the Yankees at 33-20, and the Tampa Rays, a team that no matter what happens is going to be good. They lose all their players. It doesn't matter. They lose their ballpark. It doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
They're going to compete. They're going to compete. Stick them in a minor league ballpark named after the owner of another team in the division, former owner or current owner, I guess, and they'll keep winning. Like, where do we play? Over there? Okay, we'll win over there then. Your former team, the Rangers, are under 500.
Yeah. Well,
so you jumped off.
I guess I cursed them.
Maybe so. Well, if you're on at least Blue Sky, there's a small collection of Mariner fans that are really got their chest out over the Mariners. But I'm just thinking, okay, this time last year they had a bigger lead and blew it really fast.
So you probably trust them to do that again.
I'm hoping. Some of these teams have a habit. We've I've mentioned to you, don't get too excited about the Padres. Mm-hmm. They have known to really fall apart in August.
I stand by what I said. They already made history this year, so I'm good to go.
Good to go.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I went to see a concert last week.
What'd you go see?
I went to see Deafheaven.
Okay. One of your favorite bands.
One of my favorite bands. That Emos in Austin, a suburban joint, holds about 1,000 people. Second time I've seen Deafheaven. They've got a new record out. I mentioned them when we did the first quarter, best of the first quarter for me. Really dynamic show. I really enjoyed myself. I didn't fit in. It's not Deafheaven is not my demographic necessarily. It's a very young crowd. A lot of black clothing. I wore a gray polo shirt and blue jeans, and I didn't really fit in clothing wise.
They probably thought you worked there.
They thought I was security.
Right. Yeah, I saw some of the videos for that show.
Yeah, I showed you a little bit of it. Yeah, it was a lively show. I got a real kick out of the opening act. I didn't see the first act. There was a band called Trauma Ray, which you've heard of. You mentioned.
Yeah.
Out of Fort Worth, kind of a shoegaze band, and then you had the death metal band Gate Creeper from Phoenix, Arizona.
Yeah, you told me a little bit about those guys. Weren't impressed.
They went through all the tropes. The swirling hair. What did you call that? The
windmill. The
windmill hair and standing beside each other and picking up the neck of the guitar at the same time, and all the banging the head while they pound one chord at the fastest possible speed. Interesting group.
Falls into that death metal category of faster and eviler than you.
Exactly. I love the fact I've never seen this before. The opening act had more stuff on the stage than the headliner. So they had the Marshall stacks. I don't know if they were Marshall. I was too far away. My eyesight's not what it used to be, but it was something stacks, probably Marshall. Mm-hmm. They had the Marshall stacks. They had they had these skeletons cast around,
Yeah, but I've seen that kind of thing before. But to be fair, it was Alice Cooper opening, so
Okay, there you go.
Of course, he was going to have a lot of stuff on stage with the chair and the guillotine.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. And then their show's over, and then they have to haul all the stuff away, and then Deafheaven comes out, and there's little amps off to the side, mic'd, and They did have, I don't know if they use inner ear, but they did have the one thing that they did have was the monitors in the front. Mm-hmm. And so that way they could stand on the monitor. Right. And when they're playing their guitar solos and stuff. So, but fun show. Deafheaven's becoming a favorite. They're really good. So.
Cool.
And Loose Helmet keeps rolling.
Oh, yeah. We're headed to Dallas in end of July. Going to play 3 nights up there. We just had our CD release party, so.
Yeah. I was going to go, but it was a bad timing for me. I couldn't get away. But
yeah.
When Rex is no longer on the podcast, you know that Loose Helmets hit it big.
Yeah, I'll still be on the podcast. Why not?
He'll be phoning in from Des Moines.
There's got to be nowhere we're playing on a Monday night.
Yeah, some college town in the Midwest, and Rex is phoning in before the show.
Hey, man, good times. Good times.
You bet. All right. Well, we're glad to be back. Rex, glad to be back.
Absolutely.
We are on YouTube now. So if you go to YouTube and punch in Hooks and Runs, you will not get the live Craig and Rex show, but you will get the audio with some, what is that called? I don't even know. Animation.
Animation. There you go.
Minor animation.
Mm-hmm.
And
think lo-fi radio, and you'll know exactly what. On YouTube. And
but it's there. It's there. It's another way to listen, and we certainly would, love to have you follow or subscribe to our podcast. We'll be weekly through the remainder of the year for sure. So certainly appreciate you sticking with us during our little break in May, and we'll be coming at you every Thursday, give or take a day from here, at least to the end of the year. So anything else, Rex? What have we missed?
I think we got it.
We'll be back next week with another episode. Everybody take care.
This has been Hooks and Runs, a podcast about baseball, music, and culture. If you like what you heard in this episode, share the podcast to your social media or tell a friend about us. Hooks and Runs will be back next Thursday. We hope to see y'all then. Thank y'all for listening.
I've always been a big Pete Rose fan. I grew up in the area, but actually today I saw a lady in my office who went to high school with Pete Rose.
Oh, really?
She's been seeing her for 20 years, but we were talking one day, and I was asking her, you're from Cincinnati? You went to Cincinnati West? No, that's where Pete Rose. And she was, yeah, he was in my class. So one day I asked her, I said, so what was? And she's this nice little old lady. A lot of times she's got a Bible on her lap, going to Bible study and stuff, but I said, what was Pete Rose like in high school? She kind of paused a minute and grinned. She goes, well, he was a great athlete. And she goes, but let me put it this way. Nice girls didn't go out on dates with Pete Rose if they wanted to stay nice girls. That sums it up.
That sounds like Pete Rose, all right. So what do you think about supposedly he's going to be eligible now to be on the ballot. Yeah. I don't know how that's all going to work, but
I think he deserved to be in it years ago. I grew up sledding head first all the time in Little League when I was 10 years old because of him. There's no doubt the way he played the game and stuff, he deserved it. But what absolutely drives me crazy is the hypocrisy of baseball. They put Bud Selig in the first ballot when he turned a blind eye to the whole steroid era.
Yeah.
And ruined it. But, you turn on a TV right now, it takes 2 hours of commercials for gambling sites before you get to watch the game.
There is a lot of hypocrisy. It goes back
further.
But
they want you to know that only Pete Rose and Joe Jackson ever put a bet on baseball in history. Make up your mind. But
I get it. I kind of feel like history speaks for itself, and it is a Hall of Fame. It isn't a Hall of Virtue.
Yeah, and if you're going to use the morality clause and say, well, Pete Rose went out with 16. There might be two guys left,
exactly.
Brooks Robinson, and, there won't be anybody left in the Hall of Fame. So.
Yeah. So, well, we'll see. Well, I don't know what we're going to say. We're going to do that Monday. We're going to do the other part Monday and see what.
Fun.
But Rex is going to have a lot to say about Pete Rose because he's
so it should be fun.
Yeah, should be. So listen, thank you for your time and let you know. So thanks. Appreciate you being here.
Yeah. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.